Awesome.
All right, we're live, Elsie. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, super excited to have you here today. So, hi everyone that's joining us live, and for guests that are joining us and doing a playback in the future, I'm your host of the Just Out It Masterclass series. My name is Jonna Standish, and I'm the head of business development at MyDAO. And I'm involved in a couple of DAOs myself, such as Bankless DAO. I'm one of the ombuds there, and also a really interesting venture capital DAO called FTW DAO. The Just DAO It Masterclass series is an extension of the Just DAO It podcast, which was founded by MyDAO's CEO and co-founder Adam Miller. So the masterclass series that we have going today is a new live streaming series. It's something that we're trying out and we're iterating as we go. And these sessions are really intended for everybody, but with the emphasis on Web3 lawyers, DAO projects, tax advisors, and anybody that's just curious to learn more about Web3. So a big part of what we do with the Just DAO It podcast and the Just DAO It Masterclass series is to offer free education to the Web3 community. So we encourage people to ask questions and to ask why, and today's session is no different. And today's session, I'm really excited to welcome our guest today. Our guest today is blockchain lawyer named Elsie Cole. Welcome, Elsie. Super happy to have you here today.
Happy to be here.
All right, great. So I'll give a quick introduction of you from my dealings with you, and then I'm going to turn it over to you to actually give a proper introduction. So Elsie offers both jurisdictionally agnostic and jurisdictionally specific information for DAOs and Web3 projects around the globe. She is a member of Legal Now and also a member of Blockchain Lawyers Group. And MyDAO, she's also part of MyDAO's global partner network of Web3 lawyers. And we've been thrilled to work with Elsie since last year. I actually met Elsie last year at Decentral in Miami, and we've had a really great working relationship with her ever since. And most recently, we were both at ECC in Paris, and we did some workshops there and spoke on some panels together. And I learned a fun fact about you, Elsie, at that time, when you asked me how to get to Club Berrière on the Champs-Élysées in Paris. I learned that Elsie, in her spare time from when she's not lawyering, she's also a professional poker player, which is a super cool fun fact about you. So welcome, happy to have you here today. And I'm going to turn it over to you for an introduction to yourself. And then I'll just share with the audience our learning objectives for today in the way that people can get in touch with you. I have the tile up on the screen that has your Telegram contact info, and mine is up there as well. But Elsie, please introduce yourself.
Well, thank you for the kind words. Yes, I'm Elsie. I'm a blockchain attorney and in emerging tech. I'm not just limited to blockchain, although blockchain has a super heavier lift in a lot of ways. I'm with International Blockchain Legal. We're a boutique blockchain firm that services anything Web3 related at any stage of its project. And it's really exciting. I get to travel the globe and speak at several conferences throughout the year in different really cool places, and I also get to help different builders in various ways. For example, ETH Denver, I was with a hacker house participating in the hackathon part, so that was really cool. Not a lot of attorneys get that kind of hands-on experience, so grateful to be where I'm at and practicing what I do and enjoying my free time of playing poker in different casinos around the globe.
That is a super cool fun fact about you. So anybody out there that's a poker player should definitely hit Elsie up either way, whether they need the legal advice, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. All right. Well, yeah, I'm just going to cover. So this new Just DAO It Masterclass series, as I said, was intended really. It's for everybody. But what I wanted to do is because I actually work with a lot of the lawyers that are MyDAO's partners, and I think it's a really good venue to be able to provide some deep dive knowledge to not only our clients, but just anybody in this space that's looking to learn more, or people that are looking for a lawyer, and just to understand, like, for today, for example, what we're going to cover. So what I asked Elsie to cover today, because we've worked on a lot of things together, and she will go deep with a lot of the clients and even prospects that we have, talking about the regulatory considerations specifically for DAOs and founders. And so we thought today's session could be a great way to help just Web3 community and anybody that's just curious to learn more about blockchain or crypto or DAOs or Web3, because all of those things are not the same. And that can be a whole other session on another day. But today we're going to cover 3 learning objectives. We're going to understand more about the regulatory impacts for DAO projects, and Elsie's going to get into that for us. Then we're also going to understand the pros and the cons of legal jurisdiction options in Web3, because we know there are lots of options today, but there's also a lot of misinformation out there. So hopefully, Elsie, you can help provide some clarity on that without giving people legal advice on a live stream. And then, yeah, would love to have you get into helping the community understand the risks for founders and DAO members specifically.
Absolutely.
Okay, so why don't we just jump right into it then? So as far as today's masterclass topic, and again, Elsie's contact information is up here on Telegram. So if you want to ask questions during the session, you can ask us live on LinkedIn Live in the chat, or you can send us a Telegram message, or you can feel free to contact us after with any questions that you have. So yeah, let's get into the first part here, understanding the regulatory impact on a DAO project. That's kind of a big topic, especially considering a lot that we've seen unfold in the media in the last, I'll just say in the last 6 months, with like OkiDAO, DXDY, and although not a DAO, the whole SBF ruling recently has also, I think, made a lot of people happy, but it's also brought up even more concern over anytime people hear the word crypto, right? So again, that's a whole other topic in and of itself, is just the image problem that word alone has. But let's get into like, what are some of the regulatory impacts for a DAO project, and what should anybody that's involved in a DAO or thinking of starting a DAO or just curious about a DAO, like what should they know about some of the regulatory impacts?
Yeah, so I think in order to help further this discussion, getting a baseline for why this matters is generally pretty helpful. So DAOs, kind of have come in and created this other entity or this other working group style of people, but you have to think of it from a jurisdictional perspective. So the reason that this is important is because no matter where you are on the globe, there is a jurisdiction that you're in, and that jurisdiction cares about 2 things: who is operating and where the money's flowing. And they really only care about who's operating because of money. So every jurisdiction across the globe really ultimately cares about money. And they want to know where the money's flowing so that they can ensure that they're getting their piece of the action. So then, in order to ensure that, someone has to be responsible. So a jurisdiction cares about who's operating the money or operating the company in a way because they're controlling the money. And so conceptually, no matter where you are, that's what's driving this jurisdictional issue. This, where do I incorporate, or how do these regulations matter? It comes from a place of any jurisdiction caring about money flowing and putting someone responsible for that money flowing. Now, as a concept, that kind of flies in the face of a lot of what Web3 is about, which is a very equal footing world. In a DAO, particularly, the reason that it's attractive is that there's no one person making a decision, right? It's a truly equal space where it's the money might be pooled, and there's no particular person that's ultimately making decisions one way or another for where that money should or should not flow. And so because of that, you have a lot of friction between how a DAO can operate in any jurisdiction, because again, the US obviously is a very strong approach to things, but even outside the US, no matter what jurisdiction you're in, jurisdictions tend to care about money because they ultimately want their cut of that if possible or when possible. So bringing
Interesting.
together these worlds can create a lot of friction, and that's where you see in Web3, it's a lot of let's explore first and ask questions later, or let's just see what we can do. And you have to remember that governments across the board are really slow. So what looked like was working for a while kind of was, but that's just because it took the governments a minute to catch on and say, oh, hold up, this is not what we're looking for. So when
Right.
DAOs kind of first started, they got away with a lot in the beginning. There was like a huge DAO rush, and one of the first regulatory responses from the US was something called the DAO report. So
Mhm.
they didn't make it the crypto report. They specifically made it the DAO report to say, hey, like this is huge red flashing lights. Like you guys are entering this new zone of whatever this entity is, and you're doing it really aggressively to the extent that we really have to come at you and
Right.
launch this whole report. And that kind of gave us some guidance. But again, this is a very innovative world, and people quickly found ways to push through those boundaries and continue with paths that were challenging these concepts. And so that's where we kind of are today, where we have a little bit of guidance, a little bit of clarity on things that are huge no-nos, but we're in this weird world of like, okay, but we do still want to have some of this ethos of decentralization and distributed governance and equality with a shared treasury. How do we do that in a way that doesn't completely fly in the face of what we're trying to do in spirit and against these regulatory mandates that kind of exist across the globe? You're seeing some states be proactive. In the United States, you've got, I think there's maybe a dozen states with different DAO legislations or rules on their um, in their statutes now that have actually been adopted or that are about to be coming into play. But that doesn't make those necessarily the best option. That just means at least the conversation started and is kind of moving forward. And you're seeing
Right.
jurisdictions around the globe be very proactive about trying to offer solutions that respect what a DAO is in spirit while conforming with some sort of um, ability to put responsibility on something ultimately. And that's really what this comes down to, is like someone needs to be responsible. But I think in a lot of ways, someone in a DAO tends to be responsible, right? Like if you have 100 members, those
Yeah.
100 members are not equal participants, even if they want to think they are. Someone's brainstorming, someone's offering up ideas, someone's moving the ball forward. And who that is might be different each day, but it isn't necessarily equal, even if they want it to be in theory.
So that's a really interesting point. And although you and I might know the answers to these questions, I think for the audience, I think it's really important to point out there's three things that came up in what you just shared there that I would like to dig into a little bit more. So, for example, you talked about responsibility and that shifting and I guess flowing maybe with time, right? And so if you are actually, let's just say if you do not yet have a legal entity or a legal wrapper, as they say, if you don't currently have a legal wrapper, and let's say you're a group of like, I don't know, 10 or 5 to 10 people that are in the Web3 space and we're all friendly, we worked on other projects together and we have day jobs, but we're also embarking on this other side project that we'd like to pursue. And maybe let's just say, for example, like you and I and a few other people are going to embark on a project while we keep our day jobs and we're transparent that we work on different projects. If we then applied for some sort of grant or went for funding or anything like that, if we won that, if we were so fortunate to win that and to be able to embark on that project, what first of all, what will the investors or the grant look for when they go to award that money to us or grant that money to us? And, or if you or I just accepted that money in lieu of having a legal entity, like what does that mean?
Yeah. So if you don't have any sort of legal entity for this DAO, you are generally considered by default a general partnership, which means that everyone is jointly and severally liable for the actions of this group, which leaves a lot of exposure for the group itself. Meaning, like, if I personally have a bankruptcy action against me,
Right.
there are circumstances where that bankruptcy action can expose the entire shared treasury to my debts, which is like a nightmare.
Right.
But then it also goes individually, like, because it's joint and shared liability. I can lose, like, if the treasury doesn't have enough to cover whatever damage is done, I could be held personally responsible for the deeds of that treasury. So it goes both ways, and there's definitely a lot of exposure in that. And even in not forming, not forming anything is definitely a very exposing thing to do. But the problem is like, then if that's the case, what do you form is the
Yeah.
question that everyone seems to be really stuck on. And I hate to say it, but the answer really depends. That's just the most attorney answer I could probably give. But it's just so fact specific
Right.
because of how many jurisdictions there are.
Hmm.
This is a decentralized world, right? So you might have a lot of members around the globe, and that would really impact the analysis you have to do, because even if you form in a jurisdiction outside of where you reside, you might still have considerations or obligations in your jurisdiction because that's where you are. And so you are the responsible person for your jurisdiction, even if you form an entity outside of your jurisdiction. So if you're a US citizen and you form an entity in the Cayman, there might still be US obligations for you and kind of for that DAO because of
Mm.
your status as a US citizen. Like, just because you form in the Caymans doesn't mean all of a sudden you don't have to follow SEC regulations when you fundraise, or doesn't mean none of this applies to you. It just because you formed that entity, it just means the paths forward look a little different, and your homework that you need to do
Right.
is so it does really get tricky. um but the exposure of not doing anything is just not worth it. If you do have a shared wallet, and if there's any money that you care about in that shared wallet that you'd like to protect, um you would want to form some sort of entity somewhere.
I
And
see.
just because a state has a DAO law on its laws now, just because it's adopted some sort of DAO legislation, does not necessarily mean that state is really that DAO friendly. I mean, Wyoming was the first, but Wyoming also has a lot of restrictions. I don't believe it's that easy for the governance token, to transfer. There's some like transfer restrictions, which kind of flies in the face of like what, the
Yeah,
freedom
exactly.
now, right? So just because they've thought of the word DAO and put it on their laws doesn't necessarily mean it's an appropriate or satisfactory option for what it is you're trying to achieve. So I think when you're thinking through what you're doing, it's really important to ask yourself, what are my goals? Because are you really a DAO in the sense that how a DAO operates differently than like an LLC or a C Corp? Are you truly, truly a DAO? If so, then that assessment might look a lot different than if in the beginning you're just kind of trying to form a company. So maybe form that company, make it look like an LLC, and just be an LLC to some extent, while offering DAO benefits for like what looks like more of a governing board to a team of
Yeah.
people, while you still have that core mind and management that are driving forward whatever business it is you're trying to drive forward.
Yeah, and you bring up a really interesting point there too, because like yourself and myself, like we talk to, upwards of anywhere from 10 to 20 DAOs a day type of thing. Depends on the week, right?
Yeah.
And you just brought up a really great point about, are you really a DAO, or some aspects of what a DAO is doing and the activities that they are performing, from my understanding, and you're the lawyer, so I'll put you on the spot for this, but from my understanding, a DAO doesn't need to legally wrap every function within the DAO, right? They could have specific functions. And when I say functions, I mean like a treasury function or an IP function, managing things like intellectual property or a website for a DApp that they might have. I mean, isn't it possible that a DAO could actually have a couple of different legal entities to protect the different functions that they are performing?
Yeah, I think it's more likely you'll have maybe other entities and then a DAO inside of it. That seems
Okay.
like a practical approach
Yeah.
because what a DAO is in oh, I mean, it depends on who you're talking to in the space. There's this is a
Yeah.
more conservative approach of what a DAO is because I'm just not that creative of a person and I'm thinking more from a business perspective. A DAO can be anything. And you can form a DAO in a lot of ways because some people think a DAO is just a shared treasury. And so a family could be a DAO, right? Like if
Right.
me and my parents and my brother decide that all of our chores are going to be split up, and we create this treasury to reward each chore, kind of like a bounty program,
Mhm.
then does that need a legal wrapper? Probably not, because ultimately, your parents have the keys and they move the money, and that's no different than them just giving you. And all that this has really done is put your chores on chain.
Right,
But
right,
that could be a DAO, right? Like that absolutely could be the future, and that could be where we're headed. And you could have, several iterations of that work for different groups of people. What
right,
what the DAO that we're seeing in terms of like trying to fundraise and trying to effectuate change or like iterate on the idea of a business, that tends to, it might be a too big of a jump to go from corporation to like a true pure DAO, because there's got to be steps along the way. And I think Jacob Robinson, I think, wrote a paper on the different stages of DAOs. So there's like the pre-formation DAO and then the post-formation DAO, and how you do your legal wrapper really changes depending on where you're at in that stage. Because as you're forming a company or as you're building out a product, you are very much a core team. There's not 100 people in a startup building out that one project. So
right.
in the early stage, you might actually probably be more DAO like, because it's pretty much equal. There's 4 people, you all are building, your heads down. The
Mhm.
workload is very equal. No one is truly like a dictator in that. That's a lot more like a DAO ethos. But as you build out and as you create things that can kind of self govern and self operate, and you release that code, now you're looking a lot more decentralized, a lot more spread out. But then you might still have that mind and management, or you might be able to say, all right, we're ready to unleash this project. It's completely decentralized. We no longer control it. The code is open source. And that looks a lot more like a DAO truly, um, in its operation and in its governance and in its spirit, right? And that
Right.
does like a corporation. That just looks like you kind of launch this, and this is like a collective group that's just carrying the torch on, similar to other decentralized organizations that exist over time, that carry the torch, that follow the same principles. But then you have other extremes where there's no principles for the DAO. It's just a governance token. I think if you've seen some writings from Gabe Shapiro, he tends to be of the opinion that a DAO cannot have a constitution. There cannot be a set of documents for a DAO that dictate what the DAO can or can't do, because ultimately the governance tokens rule. So
Right.
if you have a constitution that says this DAO will never um, will never have red in its colors or in its logo. Well, if the DAO votes and wants red in its logo, then it should have red in its logo. So there's no point in having a constitution if the DAO can just vote and change its mind, right? So
Interesting.
those are kind of polar opposite ends of where a DAO and what a DAO can do in terms of like operation.
Right.
And finding a regulatory scheme that fits into is really challenging, because if you are a true DAO where you're like, the votes only matter, it's just a shared wallet, we kind of do whatever, it's just voting on proposals and the shared wallet moves, that doesn't look like a corporation. That doesn't look like a sole
No.
proprietorship. That doesn't really look like a general partnership. It kind of just looks like this own new beast. But
Mm.
are people really doing that? It's not common to have that kind of pure
No,
element
I,
on the spectrum.
exactly. I was going to say, I see both. I see
Yeah.
with Constitution and without, and even I'm a member of Bankless DAO, and we go back and forth on this as well. So it's a really interesting topic. And of course, I know who Gabe Shapiro is, but for our audience or anybody that's joining in and is new to this space, can you just share with the audience who he is and how they might be able? I won't put you on the spot for his contact info, but just who he is and that he's an influential voice in the space from a legal
Yeah.
perspective.
So in the lawyer community, he's a bit of a legend. He's on one end of the spectrum, and then there's some other attorneys on the other end of the spectrum, and we all just spend our days arguing with each other in Telegram about what we think is going on. But Gabe Shapiro is a really well known Web3 lawyer for Delphi Labs. He writes a lot. He's really thought through pensively about DAOs, what their function is, how they operate, what the point of them is. His new paper talks about DAOs like everyone's a cyborg or a Borg, I think he's what he landed on. And it's quite compelling. It's definitely like pushing the envelope of really stretching this concept. I think he's
Right.
Lex Node on Twitter. That's
Okay.
probably where he's very controversial. But he does offer a lot. He gets you thinking about these problems in an important way. So I
Yeah.
like he definitely pushes the conversation forward. It may be frustrating at times or extreme, but he gets the conversation to happen in a compelling way, which is important in a space like this. We really have to be thinking about not the run of the mill use cases, but these like really
Absolutely.
extreme ends to get these things resolved so that the run of the mill can run smoothly.
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. And for the audience listening in, yeah, I would definitely encourage you to not only check out LC, but also check out Gabriel Shapiro, because he definitely pushes boundaries and I think gets people to react, which is exactly what we need. So yeah, well, thanks for covering that topic, LC. We could go on just on that topic alone, I think, for at least an hour. But let's just, in the spirit of time, let's jump to the next one. Let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of some of the Web3 friendly jurisdictions that do exist around the world. And also, I just want to keep in mind for those that may tune in, like, of course, I know this because now I know LC, but LC and I are both Americans. So we don't want this to have a completely American slant on it, because a lot of the clients and DAO projects that both of us work with and talk to on a daily basis are not from the US. So I'd like to try to respond to this with a non-US centric bend, simply because there are people from all over the world that have questions that, quite frankly, and with all due respect to any governmental agency, like maybe they don't really care what, I won't even say the 3-letter acronym, but maybe they don't care what this government agency thinks or does. Maybe they care about their own jurisdiction, or where they have their tax liability, for example, based on their tax residency. So like maybe we can take a spin from that perspective. Like, can you share a little bit about some of the pros and cons? And of course you can talk about Wyoming if you want, but I just feel like for people around the world, Wyoming is this nebulous place that they've never heard of.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so if
Or
we can
it's a
take,
place that I have clients that they just formed a DAO in Wyoming, and I'm like, why you're not American?
well,
It blew my
why
mind.
why don't you start from that perspective? Because that's a really great point. Like, I don't know why people that would, and this is no hit on Wyoming or anything like that. It's just, this goes to my point of there's a lot of copycatting
Yeah.
that happens in our space, and that copycat information is like there's a lag period, right?
Yeah.
So
It
what
can be,
people have,
yeah, you could be mirroring the wrong thing
you could be,
because again,
yeah,
the government is slow. So, but this is also the reverse where a government was Wyoming was quick to say, hey, let's just be DAO friendly. So they wrote a quick, maybe not as thoughtful piece of legislation to get passed, and it got approved so that they had a DAO Wyoming law on their books. And people thought, oh, great, this is such a friendly state because it says DAO. But again, is it that friendly? You have to think, look at what that law requires, and look at what it limits. So you've got some issues with transfer. Transfer is really important in this space. People want to freely transfer their tokens or freely join or disjoin from whatever group they want to be a part of. So you have to really think about what the law is saying and how it operates. But if you're not a US citizen, subjecting yourself to the US jurisdiction is probably not a good move unless you're really just looking for specific VCs to invest in you. Otherwise, if you're not in a jurisdiction, maybe availing yourself of that jurisdiction, especially in the US, where it is very controversial. Crypto is very controversial. We have government agencies being very aggressive in how it's approaching tackling issues in the space. So this is not necessarily the most friendly jurisdictions to be in. So if you don't have to be in the US, maybe think through what exactly is pulling you here, because there are other jurisdictions that are great. We do a lot of like Cayman and BVI, British Virgin Islands, where they're not quite, there's no DAO legislation on the book there, right? But you can kind of set up a foundation and create some entity that gives you less heartburn trying to do what you're trying to do, while still operating in a jurisdiction that's very much comfortable allowing multiple entities of that nature
yeah,
operating within that structure. I think we're seeing SVG, which is like Saint Vincent and Martin Islands. If I'm saying that right. Um, Singapore, Switzerland has a lot of entities if you can afford it. Um, but then I think what my DAO is doing is probably one of the strongest possible options because the legislation's been thoughtful about what a DAO could be, how that DAO wants to operate within the spirit of a DAO. So I think in terms of the most forward thinking jurisdictions, the Marshall Islands, with how my DAO's been so aggressive of getting what they want written in a thoughtful way, is probably one of your stronger options if that makes sense for you. Again, it really depends on your members,
yeah.
where they're at, and what kind of protections or what kind of operating procedures you want that DAO to have.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point there too, Elsie, with regards to, so I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, and I don't mean to generalize all lawyers, but from my experience and even my own personal experience outside of Web3, when people typically hire a lawyer, I always like to say it's almost like buying an insurance policy of some sorts, right? Like you're hiring that lawyer for their expertise and their knowledge in a specific space. And there's a reason why lawyers specialize in a particular area, right? I mean, I know it sounds so obvious, but it's worth pointing out in that most lawyers, I'm not talking about Web3 lawyers, but even some Web3 lawyers are only comfortable prescribing the jurisdiction that has been tried and true and that they just have done tons and tons and tons, right? Because I don't want to say there's no risk, because there is a percentage of risk in everything we do every day. But if they've done it 500 times, if they've recommended, I don't even want to mention a name, but let's just say they recommended one offshore jurisdiction so many times, they've had great luck with it, they can do it with their eyes closed. I
Mhm.
mean, aren't they more likely to just stick with what they know?
Exactly. Because you're right, there's a couple things going on there. They know, so the likelihood of them giving bad legal advice is limited because they know this works, and
Exactly.
are you paying for the best solution, or are you just paying for an effective solution that's good enough? And in those scenarios, maybe you're paying for a good solution that's good enough. unless
Yeah.
you want to go, say, I really want you to do an analysis of the best possible jurisdiction for what I'm trying to do. But even still, it's an interesting lift because um it's so fact specific, especially in the Web3 space, because there's so many jurisdictions at play. There's so many people that are decentralized. You've got players across the globe.
Yeah.
You may be able to do an analysis for one DAO, and then another DAO comes along and it looks kind of similar, but the analysis could be completely different because of the makeup of the team,
Right.
or maybe one thing that they're doing differently. Like now they have a staking mechanism, and the other DAO was really true pure governance. That could change everything in your analysis. So what people need to keep in mind is that the idea of, oh well, I see these guys doing that, so it should
Yeah,
be cheap for me to just borrow that. That could be the most expensive mentality you have as a builder,
I
because
agree.
just
Yeah.
because someone else is doing it and it looks cheap on their end, if you follow that path, that could be the priciest decision you've ever made, because one thing could change it all. And now you've got governments coming after you, and you're getting penalized for things that you didn't even consider because you just didn't do your homework. And by do your homework, I mean pay an attorney to do the homework for you. Because
Yeah.
what's great about the Web3 space is, like, people like to push the limits. They like to build, they like to get creative, they like to make stuff happen. And lawyers want to see that too. Like, our law
Right.
firm has a great approach. Like, our mentality is, there's not a lot you can't do. It just comes down to how much homework are you willing to do to make that happen. So how much do you want me to do research to get you comfortable that what it is you want to do is doable and safe?
Right.
and
Right.
and I'm happy to do that. And we've dug into some super creative issues. We've come up with insane solutions to get these innovative ideas out there and companies being built. And it just comes down to, we did the homework, because there's a lot of times there's a path forward. You have to dig in, and you have to trust your attorneys to dig in and find that path forward, because it is doable. It's just, there's a lift there that you need to be prepared for, especially if you want that comfort that you're doing things right, and that three-letter agency isn't going to come after you, whether you're in or out of the US. I mean, the US has
That's
a long reach, so even if you're out of the US, you might have to have a US, like, jurisdictional comfort, depending
yeah.
on what you're doing and how you're operating.
Yeah, and the other thing too is, so this kind of plays into what you just talked about there. So for lawyers and people that are business minded, or even venture capitalists, like, legal arbitrage has been going on forever, right? That's nothing new, but it's something that really I see play out a lot in this space, and that's because there hasn't been Web3 friendly jurisdiction or any Web3 legislation anywhere in the world up until really like a year and a half ago or a year ago, right? It just hasn't existed. And so people, when I say people, lawyers, venture capitalists, and even DAO projects, or let's just call them Web3 projects, defaulted to what they knew from the past. And what they knew from the past was largely driven and influenced by venture capitalists. Like, I'll say something that, and I used to work in venture capital, so I feel credible saying this. Like, venture capitalists made the Cayman Islands famous for
Oh yeah.
jurisdiction. That's just like a known thing. But if you're not a lawyer and you don't come from like a legal or a VC background, are there jurisdictions that would make you feel? I know that the Caymans makes venture capitalists feel very comfortable. I formerly was a venture capitalist, so I know that one in and out. Would it prevent, in your legal opinion, have you seen any VCs or grants not willing or unwilling to grant funds based on a legal jurisdiction that a project had?
Yeah, I would say there's some, maybe in the Caribbean, that
Okay.
aren't as favored, but that's also, it becomes apparent because even as you're trying to form that entity, tracking down, like you'll find a service processor and you'll be working with them, and then all of a sudden they'll stop answering their phone, and like the phone line's disconnected or something. So it's like,
Yeah.
those, the jurisdictions where it's like traditionally been more skeptical to work in, still remain the very much skeptical jurisdictions to work in. Um,
Yeah.
New jurisdictions that are trying to be proactive, I think there's a lot of excitement there. I think the more that the legislation supports what's going on in those jurisdictions, that's a signal, right? If you've got actual laws on the books that are favorable for what you're trying to do, I think that's a signal. And I think that's a signal that VCs will, if they haven't heard of it, will take the time to tell their attorney to go look into it and give them a report on it, and they'll find comfort in that,
Right.
I think. So I think it's definitely, it comes down to the government. So, those jurisdictions that have been shady remain shady, but that's kind of why people attempt to move there, because there isn't anything on the books, no one's being proactive, and it's like, oh, can we get away with it?
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
probably, but like now you're in an unstable jurisdiction where you can kind of just get away with anything, and that cuts both ways. If you're in a novel jurisdiction where there's laws being discussed and worked on and iterated on, that's a lot more exciting. And as a VC, you're going to think, okay, this might be a good path forward. Let me do some research and see if, this might be my default go-to moving forward.
Right, right. No, it's fascinating. It's interesting, and the biggest thing that frustrates me in this space is that I hear so many people, even when, for example, like they call on my DAO, and people. First of all, people are very smart about these topics today, and
Yeah.
also it's both positive and negative. Is that people have all become Google lawyers. It's just like people stopped
Yeah.
going doctors, whatever, 10 or 15 years ago, because they just Google their ailment and say, okay, I just need to do this. Well, you should definitely not do that with your legal matters, because we can't verify everything that's on the internet. But
Yeah.
it's just a reminder that I see lots of projects make costly mistakes. And in some cases, maybe they spent a few $1,000s, but still, that's a lot of money if you're a startup project. And that money could go towards funding the developer or other
Absolutely.
resources that you could have gone and leveraged. And so for me, I like to caution people that they should be careful of this copy and paste solution, because like you said, it can be a very costly mistake, and it's just something to be aware of. And another one that I see popping up that seems to be popular, and I just want to get your opinion on it, is the Series DAO LLC, which allows a DAO to, I'll just say, birth sub DAOs underneath it, and have its own governance in each of those sub DAOs. And I feel like, again, MakerDAO announced that as part of their strategy, which I think is fantastic. And I think it will breathe some life into that legal entity for a lot of other DAO projects. But again, it will probably be like a year from now where people will be referencing, oh, MakerDAO announced this
Yeah.
at ETH Prague, so I'm going to do it. But maybe by next year, and I'm just using MakerDAO as an example. I don't need to call them out specifically, but it was a public example that was made.
Yeah.
So maybe next year, they're probably going to be doing something completely different, but people will still be copying what they heard from a year ago.
Well, and I think using MakerDAO is a great example, because they have been pushing these
I
concepts.
agree.
They're such a great pillar of the industry to try and test out the waters and thoughtfully move forward. And they're very transparent about a lot of what they do. I'm pretty sure their budget is transparent. And I think if you're interested in following or using MakerDAO as an example for anything, one of the best things to do is to look up their budget. So if you're trying to do the same tech that MakerDAO is doing, go look at what they're spending on a dev, or what they're spending in that tech element. And one of the most eye-opening things is go look at what they're spending on legal.
I was just going to say, because they
They
spend a lot of money on legal risks.
Yeah.
Definitely.
As they do these huge rollouts, they are dropping very pretty pennies
Yeah.
on these legal issues to get it right. And they may be doing it right, but it is quite costly. So if you think, oh, let me just borrow this one aspect of what MakerDAO is doing, you don't know the internal legal structures or the internal legal agreements that may or may not exist that
Right.
support that finished product, that cost, that $500,000 bill that got them there this last year or whatever. So I would say if you're going to mirror somebody, you need to either have a really close working relationship to have access to the full picture, or a
Yeah.
big enough budget to move forward in a similar way with your attorney. But even if you don't, I mean, going back to like that's MakerDAO, they're huge. If you're in your initial phases, you've got to have something. I've run into a problem I see more often than not is you've got a group like a 4 or 5 guys, great ideas. They're moving forward. They put money in a shared wallet, but they didn't even make an agreement between the 4 and 5 people. So now you just have a shared wallet and 2 people ghost, but you can't get to that wallet because it requires 3 signatories.
Right.
So now
Yeah.
you have a wallet held hostage and absolutely no agreement, nothing in writing that says what you can do, or to embrace the fact that there was a meeting of the minds in the first place
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
some group of people. And so even if you're not going to do the formal legal like operating agreement or find a jurisdiction to be in, you can create a contractual relationship between the core team that addresses how to exit. That is so important. The exit is very important because when you're forming, you don't think about the exit. But if someone, gets married and has a kid and all of a sudden just his priorities change, that happens,
Yeah.
he loses
Absolutely.
his day job, his priority changes. He starts another company, that priority changes. Like so many things can happen. And you need some agreement that says, here's how you exit, and you agree to it. Everybody agrees to it. And this is how you enforce that exit. So I think that's really crucial because not everyone can be completely neutral. Like in UkiDAO, no one that doesn't seem like anything's been penned or papered. And
Yeah.
UkiDAO's strongest move was that there's nothing documented and no one knows who's in it and who's out of it. And to the extent that they had to serve the chat help room on the website, right? Like
Yeah.
that's a really extreme example of trust among strangers. But
No,
also it's
it's
a lot of trust among strangers because they got that suit and agreed collectively not to respond. And now there's a huge, like what, like half million dollar default, or it's a big
it's a
money,
lot.
50
Yeah.
grand. I don't know what the amount is, but the DAO itself has a default judgment because the DAO as a group decided no one respond. We're not conceding jurisdiction. That's a bold move. And to think that there's no written agreements among any of those players, as a lawyer, shocks me, but I'd be wildly impressed if that's the case, where they really are untouchable in that way. It'll be interesting to see how any of this really gets enforced if no one really knows who they are.
Yeah.
But
I
in
mean, it's,
the very
yeah.
beginning, just write an agreement between the people saying, like, here's what we expect. And if this expectation doesn't come to fruition, here's how to gracefully exit in a way that we all can agree to.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was just going to say there is like, what would you recommend? Just putting it on Notion or a shared Google Doc? I mean, it doesn't even have to be on chain, right?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be on chain, just an agreement so that way we know that even though we're in different countries, if it comes to it and you're such a bad actor, you've already agreed that I can sue you in Switzerland to get you to release your interest in this shared wallet because you've gone off grid or
Yeah.
off the board, or you became, a bad actor in some way. But you want to
Yeah.
know
And
that in the beginning because that shared wallet, has value presumably.
no, it's a really excellent point, and it's also a reminder that for people that already participate in DAOs, for example, it's not to scare anyone, but it's just to be mindful. Like if you're going to participate in a DAO and maybe you take an elected role and you're going to run for like a multi-sig, you should ask the question what sort of protection that DAO has, because as a multi-sig, you are a very responsible party for that
Yeah.
DAO. So it's just something to be mindful of for sure.
And if you think, oh, well, I'll join the DAO as an LLC, that way I protect myself. There's a
Yeah.
in California that completely pierced through that LLC and said, actually, you joined this DAO, you formed an LLC to try and protect yourself, but we pierced through this corporate veil and we're going
Yeah.
right to you. So
Yeah.
you may think you're getting creative here, trying to end run it, but really just having an agreement. Like if you have an agreement with the DAO stating my liabilities end here, and the DAO votes on that agreement, now you have action, like a board action
Yeah.
comparatively, that agrees to that contract that states your liabilities end at X as the, executor of that multisig.
Right. Right. Well, no, it's such a great point, and it leads into our final talking point here, our final learning point for the session. It's to talk about the risks for DAO founders and DAO members. So I think this dovetails nicely into that. So if you want to just keep going on that, that would be great.
Yeah, so I think basically if you don't have anything penned, nothing written, your risk is significant in a way that's very uncomfortable, and should probably keep you up at night under a lot of circumstances. But the more you can pen, write down, formulate, where there's a meeting of the minds, and then that DAO votes on that meeting of the minds and approves it, the stronger your position is, or the more comfortable you can be in what you're doing. So it depends on where you're at in the DAO. So if it's pre, big
I was going to say,
formation DAO
what if
with
you,
that core
sorry to
team.
interrupt, but what if you, sorry to interrupt, I'll say, what if you don't yet have a legal entity? Because a lot of work happens before you form the actual legal entity. Is that a good time to do it?
Yeah, I would say before you know what legal entity you are forming, creating an agreement among that core team could just help so much in terms of liability, expectations, all of it, getting just like the group to agree to how you're going to operate as a group between the group
Okay.
or among the group is
Okay.
really beneficial. If you just can't decide on a jurisdiction, if you can
It,
decide on a jurisdiction, form something somewhere and then have that entity contract with each individual.
yeah,
That's
and that can just be like a memo of understanding, or it could be like a Notion document or a
yeah,
Google between five people, and everybody comments and sort of like checks, I agree, I agree. And that way, to your point, I mean, I'm not trying to steer business away from you, but you don't even need a lawyer to do that. You just need to have people, I think, with thoughtful intentions and, good business mind, good technical mind, and put that down
yeah,
somewhere in writing, and then that's sort of like can be, yeah, what I would
yeah.
call like your memo of understanding, at least collectively as a group. And then when you do go to a lawyer, maybe you can share that with the lawyer.
Absolutely. The more you can document, the better. And so in the beginning, if you can formulate some sort of meeting of the minds that's memorialized somewhere, whether
Okay.
it be Notion or whatever, it can be your operating agreement that you all agree to, or actual contracts, like an agreement between all the people, whatever it may be. You just need some sort of meeting of the minds that's memorialized that
Okay.
will really just help mitigate the friction that's going to come, because in startup world,
It
people
comes.
will
It
pivot,
comes.
like you're going to pivot, and if you have to pivot into something you're no longer interested in, you want to be able to exit without that
Yeah.
exit keeping you up at night, or those people chasing you down, or there being further exposure because you're still tied to a project and now the project's doing something that you really feel exposed about, or they're going down a path that you are very uncomfortable with. So finding a meeting of the minds in the beginning and memorializing that alleviates a lot of the tension and stress later as you navigate the actual, hard part of startups, which is building something that's going to last and get funding
Yeah.
and create something big. And that's the
It,
whole point of all of this. Lawyers are
yeah.
here to support whatever innovations and companies and whatever items you're building out there. We're here to make your lives easier so that you can sleep at night not worrying about your personal exposures or the treasury exposure or whatever that may be. You want to worry about the actual product or the actual, company or the actual DAO, whatever it is you're building.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. It's almost comical. I was going to say that whole meeting of the minds is especially in the startup world, because you bring up a great point that we're constantly iterating, we're changing every day, we're going through a lot of amazing periods, but we're also going through a lot of discomfort and transformation, and each day we might take a different turn. So it's almost like this meeting of the minds. I say contract, but it's really just like a shared digital document. It's
Hmm.
like an agreement that you're just going to date and have coffee, but you're never going to get married. I mean, it's basically saying this group is going to come together and we're going to work in a good faith effort together, but we don't know what the future holds. That's almost like what this type of
Yeah.
arrangement is saying, right? And I think it's really wise to do, because it sets the right expectation. And to your point, it allows a startup project to pivot, because unless you have the ability to pivot, you're going to fail. I mean, it's just too
Yeah,
dynamic a space to stay stagnant like that.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah, great.
yeah, that helps. It just helps a lot alleviate the future friction points you might have, because then if you do build something that's worthy of it and you're ready for an attorney, then you can create a more formal version of that, and you'll have, instead of like this agreement, now because of that work you put in, you've got equity, and that's what this looks like. So it's like you're constantly iterating on your product, you're constantly iterating on legal. The more
Yeah,
steps you take forward, the more legal protections you want to come back at you. So
yeah,
as you build a stronger product, the more legal conversations you're going to want to have along the way, because once you're ready to launch that product, or if you have a token, now you've got a heavier legal lift. But at that point, you might have thought through enough and you've got yourself positioned in a way that you can afford that legal lift.
that's a great point. Excellent point. So these topics have been fantastic. We have 4 minutes left, and I think let's talk about, like, we were starting to talk about it already, but since we have 4 minutes, let's talk about what you see as the biggest risks, or based on your experience so far, what you see as the biggest risk for members of a DAO and founders of a DAO. Like, what are those big ones in 4 minutes or less?
Well, I think there's a lot of trust in the system. So the biggest risk is like what happens when that trust is broken, and how do you go about, getting your money back? Because a lot of times if that trust is broken, now you're relying on a jurisdiction to help you,
Yeah,
right? So you've got bad actors, and you've got to take them into some jurisdiction to have them stand, forward for whatever it is they've done wrong. And now you need a government to back you up here. So that's kind of the point of getting a jurisdiction somewhere, so that if something goes wrong, you've got the backbone of a government to enforce whatever it is they've done that's so bad. Now that's for the bad actors of the world, like the, SBFs. You need something out there with a heavier backbone than just this agreement, or your team, being mad at you, or a bad look in public, or bad social media presence. Like, you need a stronger element there. So
yeah,
I think we're seeing, as the bad actors kind of get called out, how jurisdictions come into play and how they ultimately matter. People are trying to be more thoughtful about that. But I just think you're seeing a lot of people make mistakes in the early steps, where it's like the team fell apart before the team became a thing. And there's money on the table, and now money's being held hostage by the team members that are disgruntled. And how do you, like, if everyone's in a different country and you don't have anything written, how do you even go after them? Like, what is the next step? And trying to figure that out is a headache, and it probably costs you more than that treasury's worth, though. So that money just kind of dies, and it's leaves a bad taste in your mouth, and you don't have funding to go build whatever it is you want to build. So those are kind of the things we're seeing now.
yeah. I think the most important thing is there's so many amazing people in this space, and we are from all walks of life, from all different backgrounds. But the one thing that people need to remember, you can put everything on chain, you can do almost everything automated, but we're human, and so we're
Yeah.
all flawed. We're all flawed. We all have our sensitivities and triggers and things like that. So I would just say, even my experience as an ombuds within Bankless DAO is that most of the problems that arise have to do with social issues. So someone gets disgruntled, someone feels slighted, someone was spoken to in a way that maybe within their culture you just don't do. But again, when there's no constitution that says like how we're supposed to talk to each other, you know, these are tiny little details, but these are the types of things that can snowball and really have a negative impact on the DAO. So I guess that's a whole other topic in and of itself. But just in wrapping up, what about for members? Like, what would you say are the biggest risks for members, or what should DAO members be mindful of?
Well, you need to know what kind of DAO you're in. And if there's no legal wrapper, there's exposure there. Like with Uki DAO, you know, every member is kind of exposed personally to that settlement, that default settlement. And as you know, as a group, they decided to not reply. And in doing so, that gives them a default judgment against them. And now, as a group, they're all individually and generally or jointly liable for that. So if one of them gets found out, that then like now this is the prisoner's dilemma, right? Like they, if one of them gets caught, there's no barrier now to exposing the rest of the team. So it's like a collective as a
Yeah,
whole strong, but if one of them gets found, there's a lot of exposure there potentially. So it'll be
yeah,
interesting to see how that develops.
exactly. Because I was going to say, you know, no one person likes to go down alone. They usually bring
Yeah,
people
yeah.
with them, right? Yeah. Well, Elsie, thank you so much for your time. This has been fascinating. I could talk with you about these things for hours. And so, can you just remind the audience that how they can get in touch with you, both your Telegram and also the name of your law firm, or if it's a firm or your own? Can you just share that with the group here again?
So I'm Learned Chaos on anything with the username Telegram, Instagram, Farcaster, all of those good things, Twitter. And I'm Laura at iblpartners.com is my email because I'm with International Blockchain Legal. We're a boutique
Okay, good.
blockchain firm and happy to take a call and talk through, you know, whatever it is you are facing with whatever it is you're building.
Okay, great. And then on LinkedIn, how do people find you?
Learned Chaos, linkedin.com/in/learned chaos.
Okay, perfect. Well, once again, thank you so much for sharing this time with us today. We appreciate it. We love working with you. And for anybody else that's tuning in, I just want to remind that Elsie and I will both be at ETH Milan October 5th and 6th, and we'll be hosting a legal workshop there, and we'll be presenting. So I'm looking forward to seeing you again in person, Elsie.
Yes, super looking forward to it. That's what I was about to say. I cannot wait to see you in Milan at ETH Milan and talk
Same.
more fun things.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you again, Elsie, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you, you too. See you.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. Bye. Thank you.